Hi again, fellow YouTubers, or those visiting my portfolio. Look, I want to make a video that's, I think, a really important video for those that are a little bit confused, because I feel like when you start learning about code, and doing code camps, it seems to be there's a great growth in understanding of code. And then it's like, well, I don't know how that actually gets a website up and running. You know what I mean? Um, so there's sort of that stage where you grow a lot, and then there needs to be, it needs to become practical, right? Um, and through my experience and through asking questions, I finally found some great ways that I want of understanding software development, especially web development, um, from like a sort of a bird's eye view, a simplistic sort of architecture that you can sort of look at and say, oh, that's how it works. This connects to this connects to that, blah, 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 blah. So I'm going to lay that out for you. And it's an ambitious video, but I'm going to take the very start of the video. I'm just going to explain like basic code. So I'm going to take you from zero, absolute zero, to understanding software development from a general lens. So 0 to 100, let's say, in one go. So some people might be at different stages. So the first part of this video, they'll be like, yeah, I understand how to print a variable and declare a variable. But very quickly, I'm going to go into front end, back end, deployment, development, blah, blah, blah. The website is working, So, and, I will miss things but my main goal is to just grab main, parts of the whole architectural understanding and software development understanding, right? So hopefully this is helpful. So what we've got here is I've created a new project, and I've created in the source folder that's given to me, I've created a package, and within that package, I've created a class called main. Okay, and this is the class called main. Okay, now when I click run, it's going to automatically look for, this is Java, by the way, it's going to automatically look for the public static void main string args section, which you can see it starts here and it ends here. Okay. You can ignore all this. Yeah, I'll just leave it there. You don't have to understand it. But you know what? I will delete it. Let's just get rid of that. Okay, so what I've done here is I've brought in an object, because a class is essentially an object. And if I want access to all of the methods in this class called main, I have to create almost like a variable. I'm going to create an instance of that class. Just like if I needed, if I needed to be able to drive and have storage, have some storage, and I would need a car. So I need to create a car. If I want access to those kind of abilities, to drive and pick up people and drop them off and do all kinds of things, all the things you can do with a car, I need to create a car. So what I've done here is I've said main, which is the name of the class, and then I've called it main, which I could call it anything I want. I could call it, my main. It doesn't matter as long as it's got the class's name here. I called it whatever I want, equals new main. Okay, so now I've got access to all of the things. Why is this saying that? Oh, yeah, because I changed it. Okay. So this would be like declaring a car, and then you can say car.drive, and then you would have access to that. But in here, what you see here is I've created a list of numbers. So I've said it's going to be, I said it's going to be a list of numbers, a list of ints, right? This says it's going to be numbers, and this says it's going to be a list, right? If I wanted to declare a number, I would just say int my number equals 6, okay? And then what I could do is I could print that print line, and I can print my number to the screen, right? So if I run this, it's going to print out 6, right? Because I've declared a variable and it's an int. I've said, look, it's going to be a number, an int. I'm going to call it this, and it's going to equal 6. If I want to print, some text, I would say string my text. You can call it anything you want. Equals hello world, right? Whatever. It doesn't matter. Call it anything. And then I can obviously print that out. Okay. My text. Print my text. I save it, and then I'm going to run it. Okay, 6, and then hello world. And I'll get back to the list in a sec. I just took a bit of a detour. But this is what, you're declaring almost like variables which hold values, right? And then you can, pit those values against each other, and you can say, multiply, my number times your number if I create another variable, and we can do things with this data and manipulate this data. So what this does, getting back to this, I've said this is an int. It's an int, but it's also a list. So it's a list of ints, of numbers. And we're going to call this variable is a list of numbers, and we're going to call it result list. And it's going to equal my main dot smallest sort smallest to largest. Now, I've said it's called my main because this function that I'm going to put my list into, and it's going to return something. It's going to return it sorted from smallest to largest. This function exists within my class main, right? So I've created an instance of this class, and now if I want to use any of the functions that are within this main class, I can just say my main dot and then name the function. Okay, now the function takes in a list, right? So if I go to the function, right, I'll show you where this function exists. It exists outside of this. Now, this code will be run one line at a time. First it'll do this, then it'll do this, then it'll do this, and it's one thing at a time, right? So First, it creates an instance, then it creates a list, and then it puts the list into this function. This function exists. Where does it exist? You can ignore all this code. Here it is, sort smallest to largest, and it takes in the parameters a list. So when I call this function like I did at the top, I said my main dot sort smallest to largest, and then I provided a list of integers. It's going to return a list of numbers, list of integers, right? So this declares that it's public. That means that it's accessible by other classes, not just main, not just the main class. Other classes, if I create other classes, will be able to access it because it's public. It's going to be a list of numbers. It's going to be called sort smallest to largest, and it's going to take in a list of numbers. Once it takes in a list of numbers, it'll start running line by line by line, executing each, doing one thing at a time. So first it's going to create this variable called X, and it's going to essentially, I won't go through this, but eventually, once it manipulates that list that I've given it and orders it from smallest to largest, it's going to return the list, right? So it returns a list. So we give it a list, and then it'll return the list that's sorted smallest to largest. Okay. Now, if you want to know how this works, this code works, I have another video that will show you how it turns that list into smallest to largest. But essentially, we can manipulate things with functions and then return things, right? And so it returns the list, and then it stops executing that function, right? So my main dot sort smallest to largest, we give it a list, and it returns a list of sorted numbers, and it puts it in here, obviously, right? Because result list equals sort smallest to largest my list. And so now we can print the result list, and that was what that for loop was for before. But yeah, so that's essentially a rundown of software. You know, like let's do something simple. Let's create a function. Let's create a function that does something that's a little less complicated. So we'll call this function, we'll make it public. What should it return? Yeah, so the public, okay, so it returns a string. And we're going to call it say hello to me. Okay, and it takes in a string, and we'll call that string name. Okay. Now it's running an error because it says you haven't returned anything. So what we're going to do is we're going to say return hello, right? Hello plus name, right? And then we'll end it there. So we've taken in the name, and then we're going to return hello plus name, right? Now, this will work, and this will print hello, whatever name you're using, to the console. But we can also we can also, create a variable string, string, uh, you know, greeting. Greeting equals how are you doing? Right. So we can say hello name plus. Now we want to put in a space. Now this is not the easiest, the simplest way to do it. I'm just trying to get you to see how you can add and manipulate data, which is essentially, you can divide, you can, find the average, you can take in a bunch of numbers and you can find the average, add them all up, divide them by the number of numbers you have, you find the average. So you can say plus greeting. Right. And we'll put a full stop there. Okay, so this function is called say hello to me. Right. So if we go back to the top, when we click run, it's going to look, like I said, it's going to look for public static void main args, which starts here and ends here. So it's going to run this line, this line, this line, one by one, and then it's going to stop here. So we can also say system.out.println. Now, because that function exists within this class, we're going to say my main dot say hello to me, and we're going to give it the name of Aaron, right? And we're going to close it. Okay. So if we save this and run it, it's going to say, hello, Aaron, how are you doing? Okay. So we've just printed that out straight up. We could also store this in a variable. And we can say string outcome equals say hello to me with the input of Aaron. So it calls the say hello to me function, inputs Aaron, and stores it in outcome. And then if we print outcome, we will get the same thing. Okay. So now this whole course is on manipulating data, how to run loops through data. Check the first, loops are where, you check the first number in the list or string in the list. Check it, and then check the second, then check the third. If you find a name that equals X or Aaron, then print that to the console. Else, do not print it to the console. You know what I mean? So there's loops and there's all kinds of ways of manipulating data. But essentially, that's the fundamentals of the very fundamentals of coding. So now that we've got an understanding of code, right? How do we understand front-end development, back-end development, all that kind of stuff? Well, essentially, I'll try and explain this, is essentially you can write what's called a front end, which is a bunch of code that that has, that renders, an appearance of, colors and text boxes, and it says, make a text box here, blah blah blah. It renders all that, right? And I'll give you an example of what that looks like. So if I go to which one should I do? Running to something, right? this is what a front end looks like. It's a little package here. Within that package are a bunch of pages, and we can click the home page. And so basically, this is basically a code that is stating, we want a section at the top. We want an image, the image is from this source. If the image doesn't appear, display the word avatar. The class name is rounded circle, which means that if you go into class name, which calls rounded circle, where rounded circle index app.css. Is there a rounded circle anywhere? I think that's, no, it's not in here. Maybe that's a predefined one. Yeah, no, that's not here. So let's go for something else. I think that's a predefined one. That'll just tell you what colors it's going to be and give it lots of class name round. So maybe it's going to round off the edges of the image. Maybe it's going to do a bunch of stuff. But it calls that class. It's going to say, we want the image to have 150 pixels wide, right? So we give it details, et cetera, et cetera. Here's a row. We can say, we want this text on the field, full name. So we're going to wrap it in some card text, et cetera. So what this looks like is, let's just go to, okay, so if I've got to log in, right? I think this is the right login. I've enabled two-factor authentication. That's a bad one. Oops. Let's go back. I think this one hasn't enabled. Just log me in. Yes. Okay, so if we look at this, we can say, the code is saying, put in full name, and that's where you see this here, right? And then fill it with something in local storage and get the item name. So what I want you to understand is not how that's working, but how this front end is code that is saying, I want the background to be gold. I want the user's full name, the email, and the password. That's not the actual password, and that's hashed. But we're getting into that. That's a different conversation. But I just want the visual, the front end is just how is it going to look, right? So what happens is that the front end communicates is a code that says everything about how things should be structured and where things go, information goes. Then we have the back end. The back end, okay. What happens is the front end, when you visit a website, you get the front end, all the code to render the front end in your browser, right? And then what happens when you get all of that code? The front end has methods, like we showed before, that actually call the back end APIs or the functions in the back end, right? So there could be a function in the back end that says, say hello to me, And the front, now that you've visited the website and you've downloaded essentially all of the information all of the code in the front end, the front end code is going to execute, and the front end code in most cases is going to call a backend API, which is a function that will do things. So, for example, we can call the front end will call the server that the back end exists on, and which through a URL. Each API will have its own unique URL, and it will say, access this URL, access the function get my name, say hello to me, and give it the name Aaron, which I input in the front end that I've received, and it's going to make the call. It's going to call them up, call the API up. The API is then going to return data to the front end, and the front end is going to say, well, okay, we got the data. We got the, say, hello, Aaron, how are you doing? Data. And now we're going to display that on the screen, because remember, the front end is only concerned with displaying and making calls for asking for information. And then if it gets it, it's going to render it, display it, right? So API is essentially functions. Now, a lot of the time, you might be thinking, where does this, what about if the backend wants wants to return data to the front end that is in a database somewhere, because we would need a database. So backends, in almost every instance, access tables in a database, right? Tables that exist in a database. So this is your database, right? So if I have an account on a website, and I go onto my computer and I access, just say, a bank account, and I go to www.bank.com.au, and it renders. What I do is, when I access that www.bank.com, I receive the front end into my browser, the code. Then when I want to log in, I can type in my username or email and password, and then I click submit. Now, when I click submit, that makes a call to a function that exists in the back end, and that function might be called valid. Check if user is valid, right? And so the back end runs the code. It checks if the user is valid, right? Now, if the user is valid, it might respond. It might return like a special security token that the front end goes, oh, thanks, and it stores it in the front end somewhere on your computer, in a cookie, in local storage, etc. And then immediately after it receives the token, okay, it goes, okay, well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to make another call to the back end with my token. So I'm going to send the back end my token, and I'm going to call a function in the back end called get my details. Username, email, address, number of years account has existed, get my data. And so the back end runs code that needs to get the individual's data. Now, the backend function might check the JWT token or the security token that it's received from the front end, and say, first it's going to check if this thing's actually valid and legitimate. And it goes, if it is legitimate, then call the database and say, hey, select everything from the users table where username equals, Aaron Marinelli, right? So we've got tables in the database. And you know what tables look like, right? Like tables, you know what tables look like, right? We're talking about way that actually works. We're talking about things that obviously talking about, columns. How do we make this bloody thing? We've got these columns, and then we've got, we call this, ID number, right? And then in here we've got name, and then we might have email address, and then we've got a bunch of entries. You've ever seen an Excel sheet, you know what I'm talking about. That's not going to work. You know what tables look like, right? You've got a bunch of these. You've got, a bunch of these things. Right, and then ID number starting at 1, and then we got 2, and then 3, and we can say Aaron Marinelli, and then we can say Joe Blog, and then we can say Matt Hughes or whatever. It doesn't matter. Matt Johns or something, whatever. And so what this backend will do is if the function will start, the front end's called the backend API function and said here, through a URL, specific URL, and said here's a JWT token, return to me all the relevant information for this user. So it validates the token, and then it might sort of half decrypt the token, manipulate the token so it shows the user's ID number. And then the backend will say, oh, okay, we need to grab that from some tables in a database. And we'll say select all from, and this table, we'll name this table. We'll name it users. Right? And it might execute a statement saying select all from users where ID number equals 1. And then the database will return, okay, select a name from users, right, where ID equals 1. There's only one name in users where ID equals 1. So that's Aaron Marinelli. So it returns that to the backend. The backend says, okay, now I've got the name, and now I'm going to return that to the front end. The front end's going to display your name, right? So what happened is you went to the URL, you got the code for the front end, you logged in, then it made a call to the back end. First it made in a login call. It said, hey, log in with these numbers that the user has entered into the front end that it has. Return it's valid, because maybe it checks the database to see if those login credentials are valid. And then it returns, a response. The backend gives it a JWT token. Then it goes, okay, I want my name to appear on the front end. So it sends the JWT token to the backend and calls a specific API in the backend, a specific function in the backend that might be, say, return name. And the function takes in a JWT token. The backend looks at the JWT token, works out that it's that the ID number is 1. Then the backend calls the database and says, hey, we're looking for all the information, all the name of the person who has an ID of 1. So it gives it the right statement, SQL statement, which is select a name from users where ID number equals 1. And the database goes, okay, Aaron Marinelli. So it returns that to the backend. The backend goes up, got it from the database, and then it returns it to the front end. The front end renders your name. Okay, so we've got these 3 essential parts of software website, right? And keep in mind that this exists in these tables exist in the database, right? And might have other tables, etc. So what we can do is we can write code that is a front for the front end. And example of a call made to an API. Let me give you an example of what it might look like. It's actually not here where the API is made. Let's go with projects page. Okay, so it says try fetch, and this is the API or that is called. Okay, and this is the URL for the backend. So this is how you access. What the hell am I doing? I can't copy it. Anyway, this is the URL. This is the URL that exists for a method called authenticate. Right. The authenticate method. Now, if I close up my front end, I'll show you. I think it's this one. This is the back end. In Java, it's in the controller class. Using controller. So this is authenticate. So it's going to call this method. It's going to do a bunch of stuff, right? So it calls the authenticate method on this, and this is what server it exists on, right? Because every computer has an IP address, right, and a port number to access, and then blah 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 blah. So so that's. I feel like that's pretty much, and then when it gets the data, if response is okay, it's going to store the token it's going to store the token. It's blah, blah, blah. It's going to create a variable. It's going to store that JWT token. If response is okay, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, so you get the general gist. I'm not going to go into huge detail, but you get the overall architecture of software development, specifically for websites, right? So this can exist on an AWS server. Then back, and we can call this server 1. And essentially a server is a computer. We can say this exists on server 1. We can put the back end on the same server that the front end is on, but just for understanding, copy. We can also put it on a different server, and we can say server 2, and we could even put the database also needs to exist on a server somewhere, right? So we can put them on separate servers, right? So server 3, if we wanted to. Let me just put that at the top. How do you make it at the top? All right, I don't know. How do we make that at the top? Up and down. Anyway, we can put it on server 3, right? So we've got 3 servers, computers which act as, they take in information, they give out information. When we access the website, we're basically grabbing the front end and putting it into our thing and running that code. That code often calls a back end, right, from our machine. And the back end either returns the information we want or it doesn't. The back end gets that information from an SQL, or not an SQL. It doesn't always get from SQL database, but from a database which just has a bunch of tables. So I feel like that's pretty much the full run through of it. Software development is kind of in a nutshell. I didn't, obviously there's things that I missed, but going into software, you can sort of understand. I think a really good foundational architectural understanding really helps and gives context to, what you're seeing and what you're doing. So there you go. That's my tutorial, and hope you enjoyed it, and I hope it helps you in some way. Thanks very much for listening. Bye for now.